The Vietnam War, one of the most complex, controversial, and devastating conflicts of the 20th century. For nearly 2 decades, the United States fought a war that tested its military, political, and moral resolve. What began as an effort to contain communism spiraled into a brutal war of attrition that cost millions of lives and ultimately ended in one of America's greatest foreign policy failures. But why did the U.S. enter Vietnam? What made the war so difficult to win? And how did it shape global politics for decades to come? This is the deep history of America's longest war, the Vietnam War. The roots of conflict, colonialism, and the rise of communism. To understand the Vietnam War, we must go back to the era of French colonial rule in Indochina. For over a century, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were under French control, with the Vietnamese people living under harsh colonial rule. However, in 1941, a communist revolutionary named Ho Chi Minh formed the Viet Minh, a nationalist movement dedicated to freeing Vietnam from foreign rule. During World War II, Japan occupied Vietnam, weakening French control. By 1945, with Japan's defeat, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam's independence, quoting the U.S. Declaration of Independence in his speech. But France refused to relinquish its colony. This led to the First Indochina War, 1946 to 1954, in which Ho Chi Minh's communist forces fought the French for control of Vietnam. The war ended with the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, where the French suffered a humiliating defeat. That same year, the Geneva Accords temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, the North under Ho Chi Minh's communist government, and the South under Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunch anti-communist backed by the U.S. This division set the stage for the Vietnam War. America's growing involvement, the domino theory, the Cold War, was in full swing, and the U.S. feared the spread of communism. President Dwight D. Eisenhower introduced the domino theory, the belief that if one country fell to communism, neighboring countries would follow. By the late 1950s, a new insurgency was growing in South Vietnam, the Viet Cong, communist guerrilla fighters backed by the North. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy increased U.S. military advisors in Vietnam to help the South Vietnamese government combat the Viet Cong. But South Vietnam was unstable. Ngo Dinh Diem's oppressive policies alienated many Vietnamese, and in 1963, he was assassinated in a U.S.-backed coup. The country spiraled into political chaos, making U.S. intervention even more likely. Then came the event that escalated the war to a full-scale conflict, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Escalation, the Gulf of Tonkin and full-scale war on August 2, 1964. The U.S. destroyer USS Maddox reportedly clashed with North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. A second disputed attack allegedly occurred on August 4th. President Lyndon B. Johnson used this incident to push for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which gave him broad authority to wage war in Vietnam. By 1965, the U.S. launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam. That same year, the first U.S. combat troops landed in Vietnam, marking the official start of American ground involvement. From this point on, the war became a brutal and costly struggle. The challenges of fighting in Vietnam, the U.S. military, the most powerful in the world, faced unexpected difficulties in Vietnam. Unlike conventional wars, Vietnam was a guerrilla conflict where the enemy blended into the jungle, used hit-and-run tactics, and relied on a vast network of underground tunnels. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a supply route running through Laos and Cambodia, allowed North Vietnam to reinforce the Viet Cong in the south despite relentless U.S. bombing. Another major challenge was the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. Many South Vietnamese civilians sympathized with the Viet Cong, making it nearly impossible to distinguish friend from foe. U.S. forces responded with search and destroy missions, which often led to civilian casualties, fueling anti-American sentiment. As the war dragged on, the U.S. became bogged down in a conflict it could not win through conventional means. The Tet Offensive, the turning point by 1968, the U.S. had over 500,000 troops in Vietnam, yet the war seemed unwinnable. Then came the Tet Offensive, a coordinated attack by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces on over 100 cities and military bases across South Vietnam. Though the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces repelled the offensive, it was a psychological victory for North Vietnam. Americans had been told the U.S. was winning the war, but the Tet Offensive exposed the reality the enemy was far from defeated. Back home, anti-war protests exploded across America. The war had become deeply unpopular, and public trust in the government collapsed. President Lyndon B. Johnson announced he would not seek re-election, signaling a major shift in U.S. war policy. Vietnamization and U.S. withdrawal. When Richard Nixon took office in 1969, he introduced Vietnamization, a strategy to gradually withdraw U.S. troops while strengthening South Vietnamese forces. At the same time, Nixon expanded the war by secretly bombing and invading Cambodia and Laos, trying to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Instead, this led to massive protests in the U.S., including the tragic Kent State shootings in 1970, where 4 student protesters were killed by the National Guard. By 1973, after years of negotiations, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, leading to the withdrawal of U.S. troops. However, the war was not over for Vietnam. The fall of Saigon, the end of the war after U.S. troops left, South Vietnam struggled to defend itself. In March 1975, North Vietnam launched a final offensive. By April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon, and the South Vietnamese government collapsed. The iconic image of helicopters evacuating U.S. personnel from the American embassy became the symbol of America's failure in Vietnam. Vietnam was now fully united under communist rule. The aftermath and legacy of the Vietnam War left a deep scar on America. 58,000 U.S. soldiers died, and over 3 million Vietnamese civilians and soldiers perished. The war also had devastating effects on Laos and Cambodia, leading to the rise of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia and mass genocide. In the U.S., the war led to public distrust in the government, the end of the military draft, and the War Powers Act of 1973, limiting the president's ability to wage war without congressional approval. The psychological impact on veterans, many suffering from PTSD, was profound, and America remained divided over the war's justification. For Vietnam, the war left the country devastated but victorious. Today, Vietnam is a unified nation, and its relationship with the U.S. has dramatically improved. The Vietnam War was a war of politics, ideology, and human suffering. It was a lesson in the limits of military power, the cost of intervention, and the realities of guerrilla warfare. It remains one of the most analyzed and debated conflicts in history. What lessons can we take from Vietnam? How does it compare to modern wars? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this deep dive insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more historical content.